bringing you another fine podcast from Art Report Today.
My name is Michael Delgado, and I'm on special assignment for Art Report Today. My guest tonight is the LA Times bestselling author, photographer, and historian Carolyn Campbell. A fascinating history and guidebook of the famed Pere Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, her book City of Immortals is now out on Goff Press. It's part historical summary, part clever literary banter with some of those in turn, and part indispensable map. The work took her 30 years to complete, and it involved gaining permission and access from not only French authorities, but also the cooperation of other foreign dignitaries, estate managers, consuls, and family members of the deceased as well. Over the years that Carolyn was working on the book, she held positions as an arts communication specialist with prestigious institutions including the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the American Film Institute, and UCLA's School of Art and Architecture. At the end of the podcast, there's information on a special discount just for our listeners, so be sure to check that out. I'm pretty sure as a listener you're familiar with the famous cemetery, which is the eternal home of artists, authors, playwrights, and musicians, as varied as Isadora Duncan, Chopin, Oscar Wilde, and Jim Morrison. But I asked Carolyn to give us a quick primer on the historic graveyard.
Well, Pere Lachaise was founded in 1804 as a byproduct of the necessity to deal with the dead people in Paris. When Napoleon was named chief counsel, his engineers had done a beautiful job designing the city. However, they overlooked one major population, and that was the growing group of dead people, both from the French Revolution and various plagues. And the churchyards, which are traditionally where people are buried, were overflowing, literally. So Napoleon directed his engineers to solve the problem, and it landed in the hands of the prefect of the Seine, Nicolas Frochot, who was quite a creative marketer in the city, and he decided to have a competition. So they put out the word that they needed people to design a whole new concept in burial. So a first-time ever architect and landscape designer, Alexander Brongniart, won the competition, and the sites that were chosen were really out in the countryside. They weren't in the city proper. There wasn't room in the city. And so the largest was a 16-acre site in the far eastern section of Paris, and it was on what they call Mont Louis, and unbeknownst to me, Paris has mountains. And Mont Louis, named after the sun god, Louis XIV, was the highest at 1,000 feet elevation. So the long and the short of it is, it was a landmark and very revolutionary approach to cemeteries, the first municipal cemetery that wasn't overseen by the church, which didn't thrill the bishops because they lost a lot of income, not having people directly within the church or on the church grounds. And it wasn't exactly a big hit initially because the family members didn't really relish the idea of having to trek all the way out to the countryside for the service, much less subsequent visitations. But over time, again, Nicolas Frochot decided that he really needed to somehow create an allure for this new concept, and that's when he came up with the idea of getting famous people there. And he bartered for some noble bones, got the remains of Heloise and Abelard, and then Molière and La Fontaine. Pretty much the cachet was set. And then he started to kind of pepper the area with beautiful sculptures, and then when it caught on, it took really about a decade for it to really kind of become popular. And that's when the really well-known families started to compete by commissioning famous architects to build the family mausoleums. So it became this elaborate architectural museum, in fact, of beautiful styles of the era, as well as they would co-commission a sculptor to create works on the monuments.
I remarked that such a marketing plan to prime the site with the allure of noble bones would be termed an influencer campaign today.
Well, it's all about celebrity, right? it's timeless, whether it's the 19th century or the 21st century. Yeah, he really knew what he was doing. I mean, it was a big challenge because it was radical, really, for the era to have this, and with this in particular became a model for all of the subsequent cemeteries all over Europe and the United States, this idea of a garden-style cemetery, because the location was a former Jesuit retreat of Father Lachaise, and of course they used the name Pere Lachaise as another publicity hook. And it was beautiful, rolling hills and orchards. There's like 5,000 trees on the property, rose gardens. There used to be a water feature in it that is no longer there, but it was quite a bucolic environment, and the architects really responded to it. They added to, again, another level of this radical change from the kind of Christian idea of a dark, scary, mournful place where the dead resided. And the architects had a more pantheistic view of, a garden where divinity resided, and it was a place for contemplation.
So that's a pretty original idea, right? Or were there precedents they were looking at?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, Louis Boulet, who was the mentor to Alexander Brongniart, was a very, very highly respected architect, and he personally felt that the commission to create a family mausoleum was a very desirable assignment, much so, more so than doing a civic project, because, again, in fact, it played into that whole concept of this spiritual environment of a cemetery and the divinity in nature. So it was, yes, a much bigger departure from any of the previous Christian approach to burial, which is pretty much kind of exists today, this a fear of death, right? Mm-hmm. And it's scary, and yet, it's inevitable. So why not celebrate it in this beautiful natural environment? And that's what really attracted me to the cemetery initially. It's just unbelievably beautiful.
Well, there really is nothing like a good cemetery, I always say. But seriously, listening to Carolyn and her impassioned description of the grounds made me wonder about our own contemporary versions here in the States. Flat, gray gravestones float aimlessly in a sea of well-kempt lawn. It seems soulless and sterile, terribly efficient, or at least not worth the trouble to mark our fleeting moment on the stage with much effort. In contrast, as we hurry from one Instagram post to the next Twitter feed, our obsession with youth seems to pale in a place like Pere Lachaise.
Right. Well, that's certainly a societal approach. I think anybody in their 20s and 30s consider themselves immortal and are never thinking about, 50 years ahead. However, in my age, I have more time behind me than I do ahead of me. So I am treating my current day very preciously, especially in this era of the coronavirus, where at any moment we could be down for the count. So I am very aware of how important the moment is. It also became a part of my Buddhist practice. I had a teacher who, for 2 years, he and all of his students had a death practice where he suggested that driving along, all of a sudden you stop at a stoplight and death is in the back seat and you're gone. Where are you now in your life? Are things complete? Are you present with your life? And it was quite a extraordinary experience to really equate life equally with death, but they're both givens. They can happen at any time. And so that really made me think very deeply about how I'm living my life, how I'm spending my time, and especially since I think maybe, who knows, got a good 10, 15 more years ahead, how do I want to spend my time? How do I want to invest in my creative life, my friendships, my family? So I really am kind of glad to have kind of serendipitously encountered this whole idea of what death means.
Well, Carolyn has been spending her time quite well. If the recognition of the passing of time in the pursuit of a goal characterizes patience and persistence, then Carolyn personifies the definition. I have trouble concentrating on my to-do list for the day, but Carolyn and her collaborator Joe Cornish pursued her book project for almost 30 years. The sustaining force in her endeavor seems to be her fascination with history as seen through the lives of historical figures.
First of all, I love reading about history through the biographies of artists. It's always been my kind of book list. If I wanted to read about French history, I would read the writings of Colette or Proust. And so this gave me a great opportunity. I had a very narrow reading list for about a decade. I could only read about people who were buried in Pere Lachaise. And that was a wonderful list. I mean, I read a lot of the Balzac, Comedy Humaine. So it was not such a bad assignment to focus solely on French history and all of the residents in the cemetery.
Well, especially at that time, that it was so central to all the world history. So, it's a perfect prism to view history through.
Both the biographies written about these people and people like Isadora Duncan and Edith Piaf did their own autobiographies. So I got to compare fact and fiction, right? What the artists themselves perceived their life was and what other people observed about them. I felt like I had gotten to know them. I must have read, for Oscar Wilde, I think I read 7 different books.
Carolyn's exhaustive research would take her down a wondrous rabbit hole where she would make improbable connections and meet all kinds of people, like Oscar Wilde's grandson.
It was a pleasure. I got to meet his grandson, Merlin Holland, here in L.A. He was lecturing at the William Andrews Clark Library, which I don't know if a lot of people are aware. It's the largest repository of materials on and about and by Oscar Wilde anywhere in the world. In his own life, he helped to restore Oscar Wilde's tomb in Pere Lachaise. He partnered with a foundation in Dublin with the French government to restore the tomb. So every time, one connection led to another connection I had the same experience with Jim Morrison. I got to meet Ray Manzarek and Alain Rounet and all of these people who knew Morrison personally, who just basically didn't hesitate in giving me all this incredible, intimate information about their relationship with these people.
That particular portion of her research helped form one of the most interesting parts of the book. In a chapter titled Conversations with the Immortals, Carolyn not only offers historical facts about certain inhabitants of Pere Lachaise, such as Chopin and the aforementioned Wilde and Morrison, but through these interviews, she offers refreshing insights into their lives. I asked her how, out of all the historical luminaries buried there, why she chose those particular people.
Well, it goes without saying Oscar Wilde, since he was my reason for visiting Pere Lachaise to begin with, I would have, first of all, never gone to a cemetery on my first trip to Paris. That would have not been on my bucket list. But a friend, an artist friend at an opening said, I hear you're going to Paris for the first time. I said, yeah, I'm really excited. He goes, well, aren't you a big fan of Oscar Wilde? And I said, yeah. He goes, and you have to go to Pere Lachaise Cemetery. I went, really? Paris, a cemetery? He goes, no, my ancestor, Sir Jacob Epstein, sculpted the monument to Wilde. Boom. I had my first destination.
I'm sorry to say I've never been, and I've been to Paris several times. The first time was a honeymoon, so cemetery wasn't really high on the list of places to go. And subsequent visits were business-related, and I never I never made the time to go. I was curious if when she started, were there no maps or no guides?
Well, when I first arrived, I was told to go to the conservators' offices, the administrative offices, which are right inside the kind of the main door. And they gave me this little 8 by 10 sheet of paper, and I thought, oh, great, I'll find everybody. Well, you've got this little 8 by 10 sheet of paper that has a drawing of the cemetery, and that has a list of all the famous people and these little dots, right, designating where you'll find them. Well, you don't realize when you get to that dot for Frédéric Chopin that there are 60 tombs in that location. And unless you know what the tomb looks like and exactly in the area, this is what drove me to design. I started immediately sketching, really, what the tomb looked like, where it really was, and how many steps in from one of the pathways. And it took me probably, I think, about 15 years to finally design a final map. And because it's literally, you can't even, the original cemetery, which was called the Romantic section, was about 16 acres. And that's where I think the rich finds are. I mean, Chopin is there, and Colette, and Rossini, and Bellini. It's like all their friends are still hanging out together in this unconcentrated area. And then over the years, it expanded and expanded and expanded, and now it's up to 107 acres. So I felt, not only for me personally, but friends who were going, Carolyn, can I borrow your map? And I said, oh, sure. And I would hand them one of my little sketches. And then I finally realized maybe I can formalize this. And as luck would have it, I met a cartographer while I was working at UCLA, and we collaborated, and in 2016, we created the map that's in the book now.
It is a really nice map. It's got 4 colors, it's on 2 sides, it includes translations, and for a map-challenged person like myself, it opens out to a comfortable size that's easy to fold back up.
Thank you, and it really is helpful because I've been selling it online, and I've had people write me back and say, oh, we used it like a real treasure map, we wrote all over it, and we made notes, and it's dog-eared, and it's fabulous. So, it really kind of made my heart swell to know that all these people, it was really helping.
When thinking about my own burial plans, which I do more than is probably healthy these days, but I suppose understandable in the midst of a pandemic, I think you need to pick a cool cemetery in case you have to hang out with everyone until the second coming or rapture or whatever.
Well, that was Jim Morrison's. He early on, when he was living in Paris, right before he died, he loved visiting Chopin's tomb, and he had told Alain Ronay, his fellow friend from UCLA years ago, said, I want to be buried here.
But just not anyone can be buried there.
The initial qualifiers, your family has a crypt there already, you were born in Paris, or you died in Paris. So the fact that Morrison had been living there for about a year and he died there, that qualified him.
You don't have to be famous, you just have to die in Paris?
Oh yeah, this was Napoleon's initial premise. He wanted it to be for all people. So depending upon your ability to pay, you can buy a plot that is, it's interesting enough, I discovered that the plots that are difficult to reach, that are farther into what I call sometimes the forest, are more expensive because they're more exclusive and for privacy. Whereas some that are on the main avenues are less expensive. And again, the size of the plot. And another interesting fact, which I'm not quite sure it's universal in all cemeteries, but you can rent a plot. So if families, and this is where it kind of gets into the problematic issue of what happens to a tomb that is not maintained, and if you haven't paid the rent, they dig up the remains and they make the plot available to the next person.
Wow, where do they put the remains?
There's something called the Ossuary, which is up that main avenue. When there's in the book, there's a picture of it. It's called O'Moore, and it's a beautiful monument of about 21 figures walking into a doorway to the afterlife. It's called To the Dead. On either side of that sculpture are 2 doorways, and the remains from cemeteries that have been closed across Paris. All of the remains are put in that area. It could be just like bones or cremated remains, and they're all stored. There's something like over 1 million remains in the ossuary. So, but
wow.
The good news is if you purchase a plot to the end of time, or in perpetuité in French, you can't be disturbed. And luckily, Jim Morrison's grave site was purchased in perpetuité. So people were saying, "Oh, he needs to be moved. There's too much traffic. There's all this graffiti." But no, he can rest in peace confidently until the end of time.
Although the book is finished, at least this edition, Carolyn continues to uncover amusing historical anecdotes, as she hasn't stopped reading about the site's occupants.
Michael, still to this day, after decades, I'm still uncovering more mysteries, more fascinating historical stories about, how someone ended up there, who they're buried with. I discovered that Gertrude Stein died 26 years before Alice B. Toklas, but there was something in the burial records. When Alice died, they disinterred Gertrude, and Alice was buried underneath her.
That was Gertrude's wish, or how did that happen? It
was Gertrude's, yes. They were quite the pair, so they made a lot of joint decisions, and it was decided that when Alice passed, that she would be buried underneath Gertrude. I don't want to go into the details of their intimacy, but maybe that's the way they preferred it.
In addition to the images of historical engravings, there are over 100 fantastic photographs in the book. Early in its development, Carolyn had to make a choice. Would she be both writer and photographer, or could she find a collaborator? She chose the latter, and through a mutual friend, she found a co-conspirator in the UK-based photographer Joe Cornish, who was making a living on rock and roll portraits at the time. Perhaps it was the die young part of the live fast rock and roll equation that made it seem like a natural fit for Joe. But in any event, like Carolyn, Cornish was bitten by the historical bug just after the first visit.
And I realized that I really enjoyed the research and the writing, so I asked Joe, I said, would you come and take photos? So for, I guess, through the 80s through the mid-90s, Joe was doing the primary photography, and then it and interestingly enough, Joe credits that visit to Pere Lachaise in changing his entire focus on photography, and he is now the leading landscape photographer in Great Britain. And all inspired by Pere Lachaise. He's with the British National Trust. He's their lead landscape photographer. He's got a fantastic career. But over time, I continued to move to Paris, and for the next 15 years, my photography skills grew, and I spent more and more time. I think, oh my gosh, I must have 4,000 images in my folders in my archive. So Joe and I, we both decided, on the photography, what pictures would be included. And since I had many of the most recent imagery and also had focused on a lot of the architecture and sculptures, where Joe was doing a lot of, you'll see in the book, they're all credited. I think there's probably about 27 images of Joe's, and then there's reproductions from 19th century lithographs, and maybe I have about 80 photos. So I certainly probably had the lion's share, only because I spent, another extra 15 years. I think my last visit there was 2018.
Carolyn lives here in L.A., and I was curious that with her love of Paris, why doesn't she live there instead?
Good question. I love L.A. There's just no doubt about it. I want to kiss the tarmac every time I come back to LAX. I really, really am passionate about the city and my friends and the network here. And quite honestly, this book would not have happened had I not had tea one day with the architecture and design author Michael Webb, who was doing a story for Form magazine about the genesis of my map. And at the time, I was creating the GPS app and had a beta tested it on my phone. And I said, "Oh, Michael, look, check out the check out this app I'm designing. And he goes, you have so much content. Why don't you do a book? And I said, oh, yeah, from your lips to God's ears. What writer-photographer doesn't want a book? He goes, well, let me reach out to my publisher, Gordon Goff. And within 2 weeks, I had a book contract.
Okay.
So if I wasn't in L.A., none of this would happen.
After a 30-year labor of love that's now topped the charts, she deserves a rest. But I asked her what she might be working on next.
Well, you would think I might take a break, right, Michael? Well,
yeah.
The city of West Hollywood, I was fortunate enough, they invited me to apply for their authors series, and I did my book launch at the city of West Hollywood, which I think enabled me to get on the LA Times bestseller list because we sold out. Book Soup was borrowing books from the trunk of my car to sell, and it was such a hit that they invited me to submit for a grant, which I subsequently was awarded. So I am taking that grant money, and I'm going to turn the book into a performance piece.
Oh, no.
Somebody stop me. We have a director in place. We're going to collaborate with the Bancroft Middle School, a school in the LAUSD system. And these 11 to 14-year-olds are going to perform the roles of all the characters in the book. The young kids are very excited. They have a really high goth tendency, so they love the idea of being in a cemetery. These kids, playing the roles of dead people, fabulous. They were really excited to play Jim Morrison and Edith Piaf. So we're, again, in the early stages. I've pulled together a technical engineer who's really excited about putting it on Zoom. Wish us well. I've got 9 middle school kids who are going to, and they're going to help with all the staging. It's going to be the grand experiment. We're all very excited.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure talking with you and reaching out to your audience. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to a special report for Art Report Today from Michael Delgado. My guest has been author-photographer Carolyn Campbell. You can learn more about Carolyn and her book, City of Immortals, Pere Lachaise Cemetery, Paris, at cityofimmortals.com. And as I mentioned, in a special offer just for our listeners, her publisher, Goff, Goff Books, has provided a link for a 15% discount for a signed copy. Thanks for listening.
This has been a production of Art Report Today. Find your inspiration in the arts every day at artreporttoday.com.